Hello everybody, and welcome to a video all about brushes. I have done a lot of videos about brushes over the years. I've done reviews about specific brushes, I've talked about my favorite styles of brushes for gouache and watercolor, and I've even designed my own set of gouache brushes, which you have probably seen on my videos quite often over the last year. Pretty much every time you see one of these turquoise handles, it's my custom gouache brushes. And most recently, we launched a monthly gouache tutorial box subscription. So every month you get a box in the mail with gouache, brushes, and a full-length tutorial showing you exactly how to paint the scene that's on the front of the box. There's exactly 1 week to get your pre-orders in for these boxes. The pre-orders close on November 15th. But in the meantime, I wanted to talk about all of my favorite brush shapes and how I use them. I'll do a little demo of each brush shape that I have. And as a bonus, I'm just going to show you the brushes that come in the box set. So 24 brushes total, lots of different shapes and ways to use them. Let's dive in. Okay, here are 9 different brush shapes. Some of these I use in every single painting, and others have very specific uses. They create very stylized marks. I'll show you what each of these does and what I like to use them for. We'll start with a brush style called a round brush. This is probably one of the most common brush shapes for any type of water media. You can see that they're a bit longer and skinnier, but they all have a fine point on the end. Some round brushes are a little bit less pointy and some have a very, very fine point. I prefer to have a fair bit of thickness in the hairs all the way to about the end, and then I like a really fine point. So I designed them specifically to match my style of painting. Depending on how thick or thin the hairs are, or how soft or stiff they are, you can get a fair bit of variation in the lines. And these are really good for details, especially when you have already filled in the majority of your painting and want to start adding finer details or adding a bit of a thicker mark on top of previous marks. For the most part, when I use gouache, I tend to start with my bigger brushes, and I usually start with very watered down layers and then I work my way up to thicker layers. What I like about round brushes, especially when they have a fine point, is that you can quickly go from very thin to thick back to thin. And if you have a steady hand, you can create very, very fine marks. I chose very soft hairs for these brushes because I wanted to be able to layer my gouache. And I love being able to put thick on top of thick or thick on top of thin. The other great thing about round brushes is that because they hold so much water inside the hairs, you can get really juicy marks that last a while on your page. So when you're doing more of a watered down effect or trying to spread the paint for a longer distance on the paper, whether it's watercolor or gouache, these round brushes are great for that. Sort of along the same line as the round brushes, no pun intended, we have rigger brushes, which are great for super fine details. Depending on how hard you press down on the paper, you can get very, very fine marks. You can almost draw with this like a pen or something. The hairs are very long and soft, so they do hold a fair bit of paint and water. My gouache boxes with the 24 brushes has 2 of these rigger brushes. One is a tiny number 1 with very, very fine marks, and the other one is a number 4 that holds a lot more water, but you can still get very fine marks when you need them. So I really like using these for grasses. You can quickly make lots of fine marks, and you can, like I said, you can almost draw with it, and it's great for that kind of random mark you sometimes need in a landscape painting. Next, let's talk about my favorites for gouache. These are flat brushes, and these in particular have very long, soft hairs, which allows you to layer. And the bigger ones are quite thick, so they hold a fair bit of water and pigment. You can get a lot of paint down quick with these bigger ones. And then I tend to switch to the smaller ones for the upper layers, and because the hairs are very soft, I can gently layer. These bigger brushes are much thicker and they hold a fair bit of water and paint, so it's great for laying down your base layers, and then you can build on top of this with thicker and thicker paint. So whether you're using your paint more thinned down like watercolor or thicker like gouache, if you're using a flat brush with very soft hairs like this, you can easily layer your paint. Something I also love about flat brushes is that you can easily control the amount of water in the hairs, so you can quickly switch between thick and thin paint. You can also get very beautiful dry brush marks like this, where all that paper texture is showing through. The 1/4 inch flat brush in my set is probably my favorite because it's so long and soft. I can really use it in a very versatile way. I can either layer paint like I've been showing you. I can use it like grassy brush marks. There's just so much variety with this size of a brush. Another very common brush type is a mop brush like this. It's very similar to round brushes, except that it has much more hair. It's bigger, thicker, it holds way more water and pigment, so it's excellent for creating big washes when you want to fill in big spaces, or for that initial wash on your paper, especially when you're doing watercolor or as the base layer underneath gouache. My set of 24 has 2 of these. One is a bit bigger and the other one is a little bit smaller, but it's a good combination, especially when you're doing cloud scenes or just big soft areas in your landscape. This is called a Filbert brush. It's similar to a flat brush, except that the corners are rounded. So if you turn it to the side, you can see it's very skinny, just like the flat brushes. Filbert brushes are really nice for creating softer edges. Just like with the flat brushes, you can get a lot of variation. Because there's such long hairs, you can really fill it up with either water or lots of pigment, and you can stretch that across the paper really far. I really like Filbert brushes for layering lots of dry brush textures, so I can gently sweep it across the paper and get a little bit of a softer edge here and there, but really layer all of that lovely texture. Because the edges are rounded, you don't get as many like sharp edges when you're combining different colors or putting the colors next to each other. So it's just a nice option to have. I have 2 in my set, so different sizes. You can play with different layering techniques. Now we're getting into some very specific types of brushes. These are called Dagger brushes. What I love about these is using them in foliage and grasses because you can create really specific marks. I especially love them for leaves and petals on flowers. So you can use them in so many different ways. Just like before with the thin rigger brushes, you can also get very fine marks like this. I've seen people using these for all sorts of things, but I just love it for the variety of mark that you can get with it. I think this is one of my brushes that I will grow to love over time even more. I don't use it as often right now, but the more I use it, the more I find that it's just really fun. I also have a cat tongue brush, which is another very specific shape, excellent for leaf and foliage. I like this one because you can start very thin and then get a nice rounded mark, even more exaggerated than the round brushes I showed you earlier. And you can also get tons of dry brush whenever you need it. The main difference between these two is that this one is a lot longer and softer, and it's a little bit more unpredictable. So I like it for getting spontaneous marks, whereas the cat tongue brush is a lot shorter and just ever so slightly stiffer. So it's a little bit more predictable. And lastly, we have a fan brush, which is another very specific style of brushes. Of brush shapes. You can get a lot of variation with this brush, and I especially love it for very fine grassy marks and foliage. Again, I mean, a lot of these brushes are great for all sorts of different things, but this is awesome for getting all sorts of like grassy, especially for fields in a landscape or foreground grasses. I actually designed my initial brush to be a lot longer, but I found it was almost too floppy. So the shorter hairs are, I think, a little bit more usable, and especially for creating the type of grass marks that I like to make. But you can find all sorts of fan brushes out there on the market. Some of them are extremely stiff, almost like straw feeling hairs, and those are often used for acrylics or thicker paints, but you can use them with watercolor as well. It just depends on what types of marks you like to make the most. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about angled brushes. These are pretty popular among acrylic and oil painters. I've found them more and more useful for gouache as well, but that's partially because I designed these particular ones to be a little bit shorter and a little bit stiffer. So I use them in slightly different ways than I would with my flat brushes. You can definitely create similar marks to flat brushes using it with a lot of water and pigment, or a little bit more of a dry brush texture. Most of these brushes are meant to be very versatile, so you can just turn them in different ways and get all sorts of variety in the marks that you can make. I find these angled brushes to be especially nice for creating blends because the hairs are a little bit stiffer, like I said, and you can kind of scrub the paint into itself a little bit easier rather than layering the paint on top of itself. So these are great for doing this kind of soft gradient blend. And also if you just want to create really fine details, these tinier angled brushes might be some of your favorites. And because the hairs on these are a lot shorter and stiffer, like I mentioned, they don't hold quite as much water, so the brush dries out really quick. Even if I start with a very juicy layer, it quickly becomes dry and I can get all of this lovely texture very, very fast on my paper. So it switches instantly into a dry brush texture. Now, once you've used your brushes and you can see they're kind of dirty, sometimes they look a little stained, the ends of them might be separated slightly or feel like they're kind of gunked up with paint. I'm going to show you how to take care of that and then tell you how I properly store them and take care of them so they last for a long time. The best practice is to avoid keeping your brushes in water. You want them to be in there for as little time as possible. To clean my brushes, I use Master's Brush Cleaner. You can find different brands of this, but this one is my favorite. So what I do is get the surface of the soap wet, and then I swirl my brush around, and you can quickly see it turns pretty colorful from all the pigment. And the brush tip will be pretty cloudy. So you can just scrub it a little bit, gently get out all the extra paint, and try to avoid getting lots of chunks of soap in the hairs, and then rinse it out. You want to thoroughly rinse all the soap out so that there's nothing left in there. You can see the color of this one is a lot darker, it's not quite as bright and tan as it used to be. So I will show you quickly how well this works. There's quite a lot of paint in this brush. Now you can see the colors match a lot better. Got all that paint out of there. And just keep going until you're done with all of your brushes. It really doesn't take much soap to get the brushes clean, so don't overdo it, but just go little by little. You want to give them a really good shake when you're done so that as much of that water is out. You don't want to store them tip down because the hairs will dry in a bent shape, and you don't want to store them like this vertically because the water will seep down underneath the ferrule and it might crack the wood underneath. So in order to avoid cracks and all of that, just store them flat on a dry paper towel and they'll be fine after a few hours. If you do happen to have a brush with a crack in the handle or something is wrong, don't worry, they can still last a long time. You can either sand down the handle and re-lacquer it or repaint it, or seal it with some kind of sealant, or just cover it with tape. Some of my brushes have been cracked and crumbly for over 5 years, but I still use them if I love them. Like I mentioned, there are so many different brush types out there. It took me many years and trying a lot of different brushes before I sort of found my style or type of brush that I really love to use. When it comes down to it, you want to use a tool that makes life easier, not harder. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you really want to help my video perform better on YouTube, you can leave a comment. If you don't know what to say, you can just tell me your favorite brush type or tell me the weirdest brush you've ever used. I think the weirdest brush I ever used was a grass brush. It creates grassy marks. It didn't work very well and I lost it. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you again soon for some more painting videos. Take care.